Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Wells. I'm the research director here at the Elling Eide Center. On behalf of the staff, on behalf of the executive director who can't be with us here today, I want to welcome everybody to our final lecture in our Florida Scholars Speaker Series. This series began back in November. We developed this lecture series to highlight the academic research from our state in areas that were of scholarly and personal interest to Mr. Elling Eide. Those areas include the languages, literature, and culture of East Asia, as well as the diverse cultures of Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. His passion for the vast history of this region is reflected in the extensive holdings of the center's library. The 72 acres on which this library stands reflects Elling's deep personal interest in horticulture, ecology, and the natural environment of Little Sarasota Bay and Florida more generally. While Elling's fascination with the cultures of indigenous peoples of the American Southeast can be seen in his endowment of a position in the University of Florida's Department of Anthropology that is dedicated to the study of the languages of Florida's native people. Our talk today is being held in collaboration with Project Pride SRQ, a Sarasota-based organization that works to create an all-inclusive community where everyone is equally united, supported, and celebrated. Project Pride SRQ has helped organize a fantastic series of events celebrating Pride Month, and I encourage everyone to go to their website to learn more. We hope that today's talk at the Eide Center will contribute one corner to the larger conversation about gender and power taking place in our society right now. To paraphrase Harvey Milk, breaking down prejudice begins with dialogue. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Rebecca Doran, Associate Professor in the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Miami. Professor Doran earned her PhD in 2011 at Harvard University. Her areas of study include Chinese literature, gender and sexuality, women's literature, and early historiography. Her book, published by Harvard University Asia Center in 2017, is entitled Transgressive Typologies, Constructions of Gender and Power in Early Tang China. This volume traces the development of archetypes of powerful women rulers and political legitimacy in the context of gender politics from the Han period through the reign of Wu Zhao, China's only female emperor, and other politically powerful women during the Tang period. Her aim, to quote one reviewer, is to deconstruct the images of women leaders that are historically and culturally constructed in these historical accounts, most of which attempt to delegitimize women's political power by condemning their transgressions of appropriate sociocultural roles. Today, Professor Doran will share some of her new research on dress in a lecture that she entitled Dress as Political and Gendered Symbol in Accounts of Pre-Tang and Tang Women Rulers, that we have clumsily retitled for the purpose of marketing, Dress as a Political and Gendered Symbol in Tang China. Please help me in giving a warm welcome to our final speaker of the season. Thank you
so much for the wonderful introduction. I'd also like to begin by thanking the Elling Eide Center for this opportunity and for hosting me, and that in particular for all of your help in organizing my visit. I'm really excited to be here today and be able to share some of what I've been working on with all of you. So my talk today will focus on discussions of and opinions about dress in early and medieval China. In particular, I'll take a look at conceptions of proper versus improper dress, as well as understandings of clothing and ornamentation as social signs that convey or should convey important information about individual and group identity, including social status, ethnicity, and, as is especially significant for today's talk, gender. So I thought I'd begin today with a brief explanation of the source for many of the arguments and ideas that I'll be presenting today. My talk today is based on research that I've been conducting for a monograph in progress, which is tentatively entitled Dressing the Part, Perspectives on Clothing, Identity, and Historical Judgment in Early Medieval China. So this project explores from different historical, regional, and disciplinary perspectives the variety of roles assigned to dress in China during the Han through Sui dynastic periods. So roughly corresponding to kind of the 2nd through early 7th century CE. The post-Han periods in particular represent a fascinating and complicated historical time frame, during which the former territory of the Han Empire was divided into a series of different regional kingdoms. During this time, the Chinese cultural sphere was divided for about 4 centuries, from the early 3rd through late 6th century, when the Sui regime accomplished its reunification. So I have a slide here of 3 different maps illustrating roughly the same kind of geographical area at 3 different points in time. So the map over here on the left shows the Han Empire in about 100 BCE. The central map shows the 3rd century CE, when, as you can see, roughly the same territory is divided into 3 different regional kingdoms. And then here, again, roughly the same area in the mid-6th century, divided into 3 different regional kingdoms. So throughout these centuries, we see kind of the same kind of geographical area being carved and recarved as different kingdoms rise, fall, and then are replaced by new regimes. So this is an exciting period to study dress, as well as ideas about dress, because the diversity of the post-Han kingdoms in terms of political systems, religion, ethnicity, gender norms, and so on, as well as the interactions between them, influenced on a tangible material level the clothing that people wore, while also shaping the ways in which they understood the roles of dress in society. So on the PowerPoint, I have kind of a general summary of the monograph as I've currently planned it. So the first chapter examines how influential texts from the earlier period, so 3rd or 4th centuries BCE through the Han period, address the relationship between dress and socially constructed identity. The second chapter looks at court sumptuary regulations that were codified during the Han period. So regulations governing what clothing was allowed to people of different statuses, from the emperor on down, based on their hierarchical position at court or different ceremonial occasions in the life of the court. The 3rd chapter looks at the emergence of omens relating to clothing, in which inappropriate or taboo dress was seen as a harbinger of different types of political disasters. And the final 3 chapters are envisioned as case studies, each of which challenges or expands the normative views of dress outlined in the earlier chapters. So today I'll draw upon materials from different chapters in this study, and I'll also draw upon earlier related studies that I've done on different periods. So in that vein, I'll also take the discussion forward into the Tang period, which followed the Sui, because the Tang provides fascinating further transformations of a specific topic that I'll focus on today. And that is the connections established in early and medieval textual sources between women's dress, social and political order, and moral value systems. So today, I'll begin by introducing a range of earlier attitudes to dress, and look at how those attitudes might have influenced the codification of sumptuary regulation and understandings of dress as a part of ceremonial and ritual systems. Then I'll look at the emergence of the ornamentation anomaly, which is a category of omen defined by unlucky or improper clothing, hairstyle, jewelry, and so on. The remainder of the lecture will focus on a few case studies of women political figures to introduce the possible development of historical traditions and traditions of omen interpretation that use gendered accusations of inappropriate or ominous clothing to symbolize and criticize rule by women. So concern with proper dress and appearance as a sign of social and political stability is well attested in the textual record from very early on in Chinese history. Early discussions of clothing and dress appear during the spring and autumn and warring states periods, eras associated with the emergence of thinkers and ways of thinking that would later be affiliated with famous Chinese philosophical schools, including Taoism and Wu, which is usually translated as Confucianism. So these discussions suggest the presumption of a connection between dress and identity, whether this presumption is accepted or is challenged and exposed as false and unreliable. Passages on dress and personal adornment take the form of both generalized theoretical discussions and specific examples of individuals who are judged to have dressed in an appropriate or an inappropriate manner. So in many of these materials, close attention is paid to the specifics of dress, including color, pattern, material, style, and occasion for wear. These texts also tend to highlight the clothing or other adornments relationship to the wearer, which is often couched in terms of their hierarchical, gendered, or ethnic identity, or an overall evaluation of their moral character. The idea of dress as an indication of individual virtue or lack of virtue coexists with an understanding of dress as symptomatic of overall social and political order. So early materials affiliated with different schools of thought invoke the dress of the sage kings of antiquity. And these are idealized figures thought to embody perfected virtue. Again, it's understood differently by different people. So these materials use the example of the sage king's clothing as a means of character. So one example is provided by the Confucian or Wu philosopher Meng Zi. In a famous passage, he's depicted as correcting Jiao of Cao's a misplaced view that sagely rulers must be distinguished from ordinary people by virtue of their unusual height. So he laments the fact that, all of these sages were super tall. I can't reach their height. What am I going to do? I'm never going to be able to emulate them. So Meng Zi explains that when it comes to sagely behavior, height, or by extension, specific physical properties are not the most important. The nature of sage kings, such as the legendary Dao and Shun, was no more and no less than the way of filial piety and fraternal love and respect, which theoretically anyone can embody. So according to Meng Zi, as quoted in this passage, if you wear the clothes of Yao, recite the words of Yao, and enact the actions of Yao, you will be a Yao. If you wear the clothes of Shun, recite the words of Shun, and enact the actions of Shun, you will be a Shun. Meng Zi's instruction of Jiao of Cao suggests that dress plays a really important part in conveying or even altering someone's inner mental state. That is, emulating the sage's clothing, like their words and deeds, affects a moral and a perceptual transformation. Other early materials challenge the correspondence between dress and virtue, suggested by the ascription of certain styles of dress to virtuous individuals, or to the people and rulers of virtuous eras and kingdoms. So an interesting example is found in the Zhuangzi, a composite text composed by multiple authors working during multiple time periods, purporting to represent the thought of philosopher Zhuangzhou, who becomes important in the Taoist tradition. So in the Tianzi Fang chapter, possibly dating to the 3rd century BCE, Zhuangzi is depicted as refuting Duke Ai of Wu's observation that the state of Wu must have many Wu or Confucian scholars, because he observes that there are many people there who wear their Wu dress or their Wu food. So Zhuangzi's response disavows the Duke's assumption that dress corresponds to inner identity. So according to Zhuangzi, as quoted in this passage, I've heard this. The Wu scholars who wear a round cap know the order of heaven. Those that wear square shoes know the contours of the earth. And those that wear unclosed jade rings as a waist pendant are able to immediately settle matters in disputes that come before them. A superior man who possesses this knowledge will not necessarily put on those clothes. And someone who puts on those clothes will not necessarily possess that knowledge. So the cap, the shoes, the ring, and so on are like the stereotypical elements that someone would wear to signify that they're a Confucian scholar. So in this passage, Zhuangzi goes on to suggest that the Duke issue a proclamation declaring that anyone who dares to wear their Wu clothes without possessing the knowledge that they signify will immediately be put to death. And only one extremely learned man dared to present himself at the Duke's gate wearing the Wu dress, like everyone else put away his outfit immediately. So the passage exposes the permeable boundary between dress as a signifier of identity and dress as a costume that anyone can put on and that proclaims an identity not necessarily possessed by the wearer. So as we move into the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, there's an increasing emphasis on not only on the general moral or socio-political significance of dress, but also its incorporation into kind of official hierarchical and ritual systems. So writers increasingly emphasize status and occasion-based distinction in dress as a signpost of political and social order. The idea being that everyone should wear the clothing that matches their socially constructed identity. The view of dress as a component of hierarchical distinction in court ceremonial life clearly also influenced the appearance of court sumptuary regulations, which mandated down to the minutest details of color, fabric, and pattern, the headwear, dress, shoes, and other adornments worn by social actors of different statuses for different courtly occasions. From the emperor on down to lower level court functionaries, and in some cases also commoners. So a record of court sumptuary regulations is preserved for the Han Dynasty as well as subsequent dynastic periods. So ritual and sumptuary treatises that contain these regulations sought to define normative clothing and ornamentation and to prescribe the ways in which people dress within hierarchically and socially delineated roles. So overall, the regulations contained in these materials are positive or constructive in the sense that they provide strict instructions on what individuals should wear based on factors including their social status, their official position, and the occasion. Of course, normative dress can be, and in fact often was defined negatively, through criticism of clothing considered improper or unusual, and prescriptions against its use or manufacture. So indeed, the attention to sumptuary regulation indicates the transgression that's associated with sumptuary choices or behavior that violated hierarchical, gendered, ethnic, or context-specific taboos. And so it's this type of inappropriate or kind of problematic dress that will be the focus of most of the remainder of my talk today. So anxiety and censure surrounding inappropriate dress dates back to the earlier periods, but the late 3rd through 1st centuries BCE saw the new integration of dress into emerging kind of detailed cosmological and omenological systems. So these systems linked misconduct by the political ruler with the appearance of different categories of omens or strange events or creatures, often translated as anomalies in English. And so one of these categories is called a fu yao or ornamentation anomaly, with fu indicating clothing or more broadly personal ornamentation, and yao indicating a being or a phenomenon considered strange and outside of the normal realm of experience. Clothing related, behavior relating to carriages and equestrian gear is also sometimes included in this omenological category. So ornamentation anomaly is defined as items of personal ornamentation or ways of dressing that contravene social expectations or legal requirements. And there are several kind of typical presentations of the anomaly. These include dress that violates hierarchical, gendered, or ethnic boundaries as understood during the time period in question, dress worn at an inappropriate time, and the typical example in this regard would be someone who violates mourning prescriptions required of the mourner. And then finally, dress with properties that were considered inherently bizarre or inauspicious. And this could be due to their excessive cost, a shape that was considered strange, an unlucky color, or just kind of an unlucky type of name. And then the advent of these fashions was interpreted as prefiguring socio-political disasters such as war, usurpation of the throne, and rebellion. A section devoted to this anomaly is included in the 5 phases treatises of dynastic histories, beginning with the history of the Han Dynasty, completed around the turn of the 2nd century CE. Sections on the anomaly continue to appear in dynastic histories for the ensuing millennium and a half, with tides of sort of rising and waning interest in the phenomenon. So what did a section on ornamentation anomaly look like? Basically the section on the anomaly will be comprised of brief entries or examples about the historical period in question. The examples would involve historical figures or groups of people, such as the common people, the palace women, the officials of the court, and so on. This section would explain how these people dressed inappropriately or ominously, and would also usually include an interpretation that indicated which disaster their dress prefigured and in what way. So the passages or entries included in the anomaly section would not be the invention of the historians themselves, but would be culled from various earlier histories, own records, and anecdotal collections, or other unknown sources. So the examples from the Han period are very much focused on hierarchical transgressions, where dressing choices contravened regulations or expectations regarding social status. Inevitably, since official courtly statuses were monopolized by upper-class men, these examples are by and large confined to men's dress. In materials covering the late 2nd and early 3rd century CE, so kind of the late Han and immediate post-Han periods, there's a palpable expansion in emphasis to include interest in examples of dress that were considered ominous because they violated ethnic or gendered boundaries. And this emphasis continued to be important in subsequent historical periods as well. So I think there are several factors that might explain these changes. As I mentioned today at the start of the lecture, the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries saw the progressive decline and breakdown of the Han Empire and the division of the former Han territory into various the ruling classes of some of these kingdoms were non-Han Chinese in origin or were a mixture of different kind of ethnic groups, leading to intercultural interactions at the political, social, religious, philosophical, and of course also material levels. The influx of new clothing styles during this period led to an explosion of novel fashion trends, but also anxiety among some writers about what they saw as the possible societal or moral implications of the turn away from traditional ways of dressing. The breakdown of Han Empire has also been associated more broadly by many scholars with a turn away from Confucian ritual culture, meaning codes of conduct meant to cover group and individual ceremonial, public, and familial behavior. The post-Han regimes have been described as periods during which people were more open to new ways of thinking and experimentation in various areas, including dress and interpersonal relationships. So in the ornamentation anomaly records about the late 2nd century and later periods, passages about ominous dress are also used to target and disparage specific historical figures, including women who held political power at different historical junctures. So with the exceptions of circumstances when women were quote unquote forced to rule in place of, for example, a child emperor who had not yet reached his majority, rule by women was generally prohibited or criticized according to traditional conceptions of gender roles. Women's sphere was supposed to be delimited to the inner realm of the family, home, or in the case of royal women or women of the palace, the inner palace. Historical narratives tended to adopt a conservative stance regarding gender roles to criticize women who openly aggregated personal political power, especially when they ruled during a time of political instability or social unrest. So one such woman was Western Jin Empress Jia, who occupied an authoritative position in the last decade of the 3rd century CE as regent and de facto ruler for her husband, Emperor Hui. So Emperor Hui had an unspecified intellectual disability which prevented him from ruling in his own right, leading to intense struggles between different factions at court for control of his regency and thus control of the throne. So soon after Emperor Hui took power, Empress Jia's faction succeeded in defeating the powerful Yang clan led by Emperor Hui's mother and maternal grandfather. Empress Jia was strongly condemned in histories on the period, including the earlier history of the Song and the later history of the Jin, which both cover the history of the 3rd and 4th century CE, as well as other anecdotal works with overlapping content. So these works portrayed her as a violent, corrupt regent who usurped power, violated gender norms relating to political authority, and intensified the political disorder that would, in the early 4th century, lead to armed conflict and the Jin's loss of its northwestern territories in 316. So the ornamentation anomaly sections of the history of Song and history of the Jin construct Empress Jia's rule as sort of a negative historical example, Changing trends in dress and ornamentation are repeatedly described as warning omens that predicted her rise to power. These trends are often related to changes in women's dress or gender distinctions in dress, so that they point to the anomalous or dangerous nature of her power, specifically as a woman ruler. So one example is the following entry in the earlier history of the Somme about changing styles of clogs, which were a very popular type of shoe during the Genocides. So the record reads as follows. In the past, when making clogs, women's were round-toed and men's were square-toed. Rouses expressed the virtuous conduct of obedience and thus differentiated between men and women. By the beginning of the Taikang reign period, so 280 to 289 CE, women's clogs were all square-toed, eliminating the obedience indicated by their roundness and making them no different from men's. So according to this passage, the decade leading up to Empress Jia's assumption of power was characterized by the loss of proper gender differentiation, symbolized by the clog styles, which predicted Empress Jia's appropriation of the male-identified position of ruler. So in the later history of the Jin, which was compiled later, an explicit interpretation was added, which reads as follows. This, meaning the clogs, was a sign of Empress Jia's usurpation of power. For your interest, I have here some pictures of clogs. The picture here on the left shows some actual historical artifacts that are from the 6th Dynasty Museum in Nanjing. And on the right is kind of a modern reproduction of what those clogs might have looked like. So in this case, in the case of the clogs, the problem is not necessarily what the style was looking like exactly, but rather the unisex nature of how it was being worn, right? That it was being worn by both men and women alike, as opposed to kind of having a male style and a female style of clogs. So other examples of ominous fashion dated to this period highlight different examples of the fashions as what made them anomalous. One example dated to the last decade of the 3rd century, so the decade during which Empress Jia was ruling as regent, was women's preference during this period for wearing waist pendants and hairpins shaped like weapons of war. So different types of spears, battle axes like daggers, and so on. Oh, perfect. So upper class women of the time would typically hang ornamental pendants from their waist and in their hair. And this would be distinguished by class, so that is the higher a woman's rank. At court, the more precious and greater in number would be her ornamentation. The PowerPoint image on the bottom is a hairpin with a flower design from the Tang Dynasty. The top right-hand image is obviously modern. That's the actors only in the Curse of the Golden Flower. But it shows how women would have inserted those hairpins and different ornaments into their elaborate updos, as she's doing there. The image on the left is a waist pendant that's shaped like a phoenix. So the phoenix is appropriate for a woman's ornament because it's associated with the virtue of a woman, or the virtue of an empress. The weapons, however, clearly belong to the man's realm of military engagement. And as such, they're interpreted in historical sources as presaging Empress Jia's assumption of power and the subsequent fall of the Western Jin regime. So in this case, again, it's the shape of the ornaments that are considered problematic. Another example is provided by the women's hairstyle known as xianziji, which was comprised of circular formations of hair that were held in place by tightly bound silk cords. So you can see in the terracotta figurines there, they have kind of two side buns that are tied tightly and then held in place there at the center. So archaeological evidence suggests that they might have been worn by women first in the area that now encompasses northeastern China and the Korean Peninsula, and then later their popularity moved south. south. According to historical records on the ornamentation anomaly, this style was another example of ominous fashion. So the name of Xie can be translated as holding the sun in one's lap up to, or holding the sun in one's lap bun, with qi, the word meaning like an updo or a run, and xie meaning like holding the sun. And it was interpreted as predicting Empress Jia's presumed murder of the crown prince, her stepson in 300 CE, shortly before her own fall from power. So in this case, the name, not the shape, creates the anomaly. There's kind of an ominous wordplay that's associated with kind of nefarious historical circumstances at the end of Empress Jia's rule. So finally, history of Song and history of the Qin also identify as ornamentation anomaly the fashion popular during the Qin and later periods for a vest-like garment known as liangdang. So originally, liangdang were worn by women as an underclothing or an inner garment that wouldn't have been visible on the outside. But the turn of the 3rd century saw a new fashion trend for wearing them on the outside like a vest. And both men and women would wear liangdang, both in the Qin and then throughout later centuries. So the improper reversal of the inner going out is interpreted as evoking Empress Jia's assumption of power as a woman, who should properly remain in the inner realm but went out in order to rule the state. And it's also interpreted as foreshadowing the fall of the Western Jin regime to non-Chinese kingdoms in the early 4th century. And so the image here is a detail from the painting Clerks of the Northern Qi, attributed to Yang Zihua, depicting a later period. But we can see the clerk here is wearing kind of a longer incarnation of the liangdang, but it still has kind of the strap-like shape that earlier liangdang would have had. So in all of these examples of ornamentation anomaly, the anomaly is defined by different aspects of the style in question. So the gender neutral style of the clogs, the martial shape of the pendants and hairpins, the name of the updo, and the new way in which the liangdang are being worn, but all of them are linked to the rise to power of Empress Jia. In addition, all of the examples point in one way or another to her identity as a woman ruler, with the clear message that her tenure as de facto ruler and her aggregation of personal political power contravened her proper social role and led to or contributed to major historical disasters. So the prominence of Empress Jia in important records about ominous dress emphasizes how, in these records, she's being highlighted as kind of a negative historical exemplar. I have one final image here related to Empress Jia and kind of interpretations of her reign. And this is a section from the scroll entitled Admonitions of the Instructors to the Court Ladies, which is a silk hand scroll painting illustrating Zhang Hua's earlier text to the same title. According to historical records, the text was written in the early 290s when Empress Jia was first becoming politically powerful, to admonish her and exhort her to curb her excessive behavior and kind of unladylike aggregation of political power. So the scroll was attributed to famous painter Gu Kaichi. Many scholars today believe that it's actually a later work, dating possibly to the 5th to 8th centuries CE. And so the scene that you see here on the PowerPoint is scene 7, known as the toilette scene, because as you can see, we have a picture of women looking in the mirror and completing their hairstyle and their makeup. The text over there on the right-hand side is an admonition that's meant to go along with the image. And the translation of it reads, "People all know how to beautify their appearance, but none knows how to ornament their nature." So we have here that same kind of analogy or connection between outer appearance and inner nature, and an anxiety over the possibility that they don't line up. I think there are also, throughout the examples of styles highlighted as ornamentation anomaly, there's the implication that clothing and dress, if inappropriate, can give us a clue if we're discerning observers about the character of an individual or an era as a whole. Larger of that image. So connections between kind of inappropriate personal ornamentation and women political leaders are not unique to materials on Empress Jia. These themes reappear kind of sporadically in accounts about women and politicians in later periods as well, including the Tang dynasty, which I'm going to turn to a little bit now. So the Tang dynasty, especially in its first half century or so, was a very different political landscape than the Western Jin over which Empress Jia presided in the late 3rd century. So the Western Jin only succeeded in unifying the former Han territory for about 30 years total. And over half of those years were plagued by political infighting, usurpation, and foreign incursion. The Tang was, in contrast, the first long-term stable regime after the fall of the Han. Overall, in its first half, the Tang was militarily powerful, politically stable, wealthy, and culturally rich. People from neighboring states and farther kingdoms flocked to the Tang capital, Chang'an, as well as other large cities to conduct commerce, study, and engage with local religious communities. So the Tang is also famous as a materially rich dynasty. Its lush materiality facilitated by the dynastic wealth, lively trade routes along the Silk Road, and the skill of local artisans. So archaeological evidence, visual depictions, and other artifacts provide a window into kind of the different fashion trends that appeared over the course of the Tang dynasty. So these are some pictures that I took on a research trip to see some years ago of the stone sarcophagus of the Yongtai princess. So the mural paintings showcase women dressed in lively fashions with bright colors. And so this is a close-up of one of the ladies here. And we can get kind of more of a sense of the vibrant colors that would originally have adorned the mural. So of course, in material terms, there's a lot that hasn't survived of the clothing described in sources and depicted in records about this period. But accounts about a certain subset of powerful royal women's fashion choices help us to imagine kind of the magnificence of their wardrobes at the same time that they're linking their acts of kind of fashion-related conspicuous consumption with destruction and social disintegration. So in addition to being a kind of a golden age of economic, cultural, and military power, the first half of the Tang dynasty is also notable for extended periods in which women controlled or participated at the highest levels in court government. And so arguably the most prominent of these women was of Zhao, also known as Wu Zetian or Empress Wu, who began her career as Emperor Gaozong's empress and ruled as Empress Dowager to their adult sons after his death in 683. In 690, she founded her own dynasty, the Zhou, which she ruled capably as China's only woman emperor until her death in 705. And again, only woman emperor, meaning that she was the only woman in Chinese history to take on the ritual prerogatives and official position of emperor, as opposed to continuing to rule as, for example, Empress Dowager. So after her death, from 705 until 713 or so, the court was divided into opposing factions, one of which was headed by her daughter, the Taiping princess, and another of which was led by her daughter-in-law, Empress Wei, and her granddaughter, the Anglo princess, Wei's daughter by Emperor Zhongzong, Wu's son. So these women amassed a great deal of wealth and political power before their eventual deaths and falls from power. Anglo princess in particular is famous/notorious for her attempt to be named crown princess in favor of her half-brother. So posthumous records on Wu are mixed in terms of their evaluation of her, with harsh condemnations for her appropriation of male-identified political power, as well as grudging recognitions of her intelligence and skill as a ruler. Records on the next generations of women politicians, especially Empress Wei and the Anglo princess, tend to be extremely condemnatory. In historical and anecdotal sources, they're attacked for fostering factionalism and political disorder, excessive expenditure, and contravening their proper place as women in the political hierarchy. The fashion of these Tang women provides the topic for some of the most vivid anecdotes about them. And it's a topic that plays an important role in condemnations of them. The variety, frequency, and detail of accounts about the excessive personal adornment of these figures indicates just the fascination that they generated among both writers and readers. So in terms of historical sources, there are two official histories of the Tang dynasty, the Old Tang history and New Tang history, the old one having gotten its name retroactively after the appearance of the new one. So the Old Tang history was completed in 945 by a committee of historians. The New Tang history submitted to the throne almost exactly a century later in 1044. So New Tang history overall reflects a much more negative attitude to Wu Zhao and the other Tang women political figures, perhaps influenced by a more conservative sense of appropriate gender roles. The ornamentation anomaly sections of both histories indicate these negative evaluations. So the Old Tang history section is short, with only four entries, all of which are taken from the period of Wu's dominance through the reign of her son Zhongzong, the husband of Empress Wei. The New Tang history devotes much more space to the womenological category and provides many more examples, many of which are related to women's dress. The number and specificity of examples are still weighted towards the period from the 660s through 713, during which Wu, Taiping Wei, and Anle were politically active. So this is especially significant when we consider that the late 7th and early 8th century Tang China was overall a period of kind of political, cultural, and economic strength. And that's certainly in comparison with the last decades of the Tang regime. So given this situation, the advent of these anomalies doesn't correspond to the same type of political disasters as we see in records about Empress Jia, such as war or the actual end of the regime or major loss of territory. So the anomaly entries about these women participate in earlier Oman discourses that we saw in connection with Empress Jia, in which usurpation or arrogation of political power by empresses or other women is often foreshadowed or accompanied by strange and ominous fashions. So several of the clothing anomaly examples reference the princess's violation of expected gender appropriate behavior in relation to an occasion that was, according to traditional gender theory, supposed to be based on a very clear separation of male and female roles, and that is the wedding. So according to both histories, the Anle princess had a preference for very elaborate and expensive dresses and skirts, including her wedding dress and two skirts known as the 100 plume skirts. 100 here meaning just like a very large number, not an exact number of bird species. So kind of skirts created from the plumage of various species of birds. And so this is a little bit of a long quote, but it's an interesting one. So I'm going to read it now. So the Anle princess had the directorate for imperial manufacturing, so two skirts from the plumage of the 100 birds. Depending on whether it was looked at straight on or from the side, in the sun or in the shade, each time a different color was seen, and the forms of the 100 birds could all be seen. She gave one to Empress Wei. The princess also made a saddle blanket out of the furs of the 100 animals, and Empress Wei then made one out of the plumage of various birds. They both showed all the forms of the birds and animals and cost a huge amount of money to make. When the princess was getting married, Zhou presented her a dress made of the finest silk and emerald gauze. Gold thread was stitched into flowers and birds. They were as fine as hair strands and as big as rain. Their eyes, ears, mouths, and beaks were all complete, and only those with clear eyesight could see them. These are all examples of ornamentation anomaly. After she made the skirt, high-ranking ministers of wealthy households imitated her. In Jiang and Ling, the furs and feathers of the rare birds and unusual animals were almost plucked to extinction. The skirts commissioned by Anle princess and the wedding dress presented her by the locality Yizhou are considered unlucky because of the excessive expenditure involved in their creation. Condemnation is also directed towards the destruction of natural species brought about by the ensuing craze for such garments. A thinly veiled analogy to the princess's destruction of the natural social order, as the woman who famously attempted to be named crown princess. There is additionally a sense of consternation directed towards the nature of the clothing items themselves, which replicate in an almost uncanny manner kind of a microscopic natural world. So the second example of a wedding or marriage-related ornamentation anomaly concerns the events that supposedly prompted the first marriage of the Taiping princess in 681. So the description of these events provides a striking example of gender role transgression as embodied in sumptuary choices. Once Emperor Gaozong was holding a banquet in the inner palace. The Taiping princess put on a purple robe, jade belt, and black silk kerchief that twisted at the top. She wore all of the 7 items worn at the waist by military officials and sang a dance before the emperor. The emperor and empress laughed and said, "Girls can't be military officials. Why are you dressed like that?" This was approaching the ornamentation anomaly. So in this passage, violation of normative gender roles is indicated by the imperial couple's response, that is, girls can't be military officials. And to find out the reason for Taiping's unusual outfit, we have to consult her biography in the same historical work, which contains a parallel passage that provides more information about her motives. So in this passage, when her parents ask the reason for her attire, Taiping responds, "Can you give this outfit to the imperial son-in-law?" The emperor then chooses someone to be her husband. According to the biography, the costume and the performance were a very kind of elaborate performative way of communicating to her parents that she was ready to get married and give the military outfit to her future husband, who would be an imperial son-in-law. So according to the New Tang history narrative, the princess took a proactive role in arranging her own marriage, a role that was atypical even for a powerful woman from the royal family. The implication seems to be the princess's bold contravention of convention here foreshadowed or mirrored her later assumption of the traditionally male-identified role of a political power. So in these examples, the reasons behind why they're chosen as ornamentation anomaly are clear. In terms of the excessive expenditure and violation of gender norms as shown through clothing. What's less clear-cut is the political disaster that they as omens foreshadow. As I mentioned earlier, unlike the materials on Empress Jia, whose reign was followed by violent civil wars, foreign invasion, and a major loss of territory, for the materials about the late 7th and early 8th centuries, we have to conclude that the anomaly in question was not only the factional competition between them and the violence that it fostered at court, but actually the rise to power of these women political leaders themselves. So that's kind of part of the anomaly that's occurring. Indeed, after their kind of deaths and falls from power, the next 4 decades are considered kind of a golden era in Tang history. Until, interestingly enough, the mid-8th century, when a disastrous rebellion for which another kind of famous woman figure is blamed occurs. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss kind of this political figure, but she's also associated with kind of transgressive materiality and ominous dressing. So in the case of kind of these women political figures, their identification of their attire as ornamentation anomalies used to reinforce judgments about their role as historical actors and their moral character. Which is disparate due to the perceived disjunction between their idealized sociocultural role and behavior and how they actually comported or presented themselves. So this brings us back to my opening discussion today of some of the fundamental issues raised by writers of antiquity in relation to dress. These included the nature of the relationship between what a person wears and who they are, the correct or ideal role played by dress as a visible component of hierarchical and ceremonial systems, and whether someone what is wearing is really a reliable indicator of who they are. We can see how these essential concerns and the anxieties they suggest continue to inform a subset of writing about dress, that is historical narrative and important records, that was at its core conservative and didactic in its orientation to personal ornamentation as a component of social, political, and gender systems. And this is by no means the only voice about dress that survived from the medieval period in China, but it formed an important and lasting strand in writing and thinking about dress, politics, and gender. All right, thank you so much.